When people talk about the horrors of the First World War, they usually mention the trenches, the artillery, and the machine guns. And those were indeed horrifying. But there was another kind of horror in that war that doesn't get talked about nearly as much. And those were the trench raiders. These were men who crawled across the hellscape of no man's land in the dead of night, dropped into enemy trenches and killed other men at arm's length with clubs, knives and sharpened shovels. Not because the technology of the age couldn't do it from a distance, but because the technology of the age had made distance killing so effective that it created a stalemate only close quarters savagery could break. We're going to tell you everything about their way of fighting, about the weapons they carried, about the raids they executed, and about what it was like to be one of them. But I have to warn you that some of what you're about to hear is hard to stomach. This isn't sanitized textbook history. This is what actually happened when civilization's most advanced nations sent their young men to fight in the mud with medieval weapons. Now, if you're still here, let's start by understanding what led to hand-to-hand combat in what everyone thought was a modern way of fighting, because the story of the trench raiders doesn't begin in a trench. It begins in the lecture halls and war colleges of Europe, where generals and strategists spent decades building theories of warfare that would prove catastrophically, almost comically, wrong the moment real bullets started flying. And then we'll move from there into the trenches themselves, into the weapons, the tactics, the raids, and ultimately into what the stormtroopers turned all of this into on a scale nobody had imagined. In the years leading up to 1914, European military leaders had an almost religious faith in the power of offensive action. This wasn't just strategic preference, this was ideological conviction, bordering on mysticism. The prevailing military philosophy held that an army's will to attack, its elan vital, its sheer aggressive spirit, could overcome material disadvantages on the battlefield, and no nation embraced this more fervently than France. France, still smarting from its humiliating defeat to Prussia back in 1871, had developed the most extreme version of this philosophy. The loss of Alsace-Lorraine to the newly unified German Empire hadn't just been a territorial blow. It was a wound to the national soul, and it had driven an entire generation of French military thinkers to conclude that the reason they lost wasn't because of Prussian organizational superiority, or better artillery, or more effective mobilization. No, the reason they lost, according to this new school of thought, was because the French soldier hadn't been aggressive enough. He hadn't attacked with sufficient conviction. The problem wasn't material, it was spiritual. French generals preached that an army's sheer will to conquer could overcome any disadvantage on the battlefield, and they genuinely believed it was the key to victory. This philosophy was codified into official French military doctrine under the name offensive à outrance, meaning offense to the utmost. Its chief architect was Colonel de Grandmaison, who argued before the French General Staff that the only acceptable posture for the French army was one of relentless, immediate, total attack. Defense was practically a dirty word in French military circles. To prepare for defense was to admit the possibility of failure, and that kind of thinking, they believed, was exactly what had lost them the War of 1870. And if you want to know just how seriously they took this idea, consider that a proposal to replace the bright red trousers of French soldiers with something less visible was actually rejected on the grounds that it would hurt this fighting spirit. That isn't a myth. That's documented fact. Former War Minister Eugène Etienne declared in 1911 that the red trousers were France, and that abandoning them would be tantamount to surrendering the martial traditions that define the nation. So French soldiers would march to war in 1914 wearing bright red pantaloons, blue greatcoats, and red kepis, looking like they had stepped out of a painting from 1860, which is essentially what had happened. The French army had spent 4 decades perfecting the spirit of the attack while paying almost no attention to the reality that the weapons of 1914 bore almost no resemblance to the weapons of 1870. Now the bayonet stood right at the center of this whole philosophy. You see, before 1914, rifle and bayonet combinations were designed specifically to maximize reach, which was basically the ability to stab an enemy soldier before he could stab you. And this led to a sort of arms race where nations competed to create the longest possible rifle-bayonet combination. Because in the imagined battles of the future, infantry would charge across open ground, crash into the enemy formation, and the side with the longer reach would have the advantage in the ensuing hand-to-hand melee. The French Liebel model 1886 rifle had a bayonet blade measuring about 20 inches long with an X-shaped cross-section designed to punch through thick winter clothing, leather equipment, and even light body protection. When you combine that bayonet with the rifle itself, you ended up with a weapon about 6 feet long. Think about that for a moment. A 6-foot spear in the hands of every infantryman. The Germans respected its deadly effectiveness so much that they gave it a nickname, the French Needle, because of its long, thin, cruciform blade that would leave a deep puncture wound that was extremely difficult for field surgeons to close. Well, Germany responded in kind with their own design. The bayonet for the Gewehr 98 rifle had a blade just under 20 inches long, which created a combined length of about 5 feet 9 inches. And this long bayonet was specifically designed to allow infantry soldiers to bring down cavalrymen from their horses, which tells you something about how military planners were still thinking in terms of the previous century's warfare. Cavalry charges were still considered a decisive element of battle in 1914. French generals like Gallieni spoke openly about using cavalry to exploit breakthroughs, and the British Expeditionary Force brought tens of thousands of horses to the continent, expecting them to play a central role in the fighting. The German Great General Staff was equally committed to mounted operations, and its cavalry divisions were considered among the finest in Europe. Training across all armies was based on thrust, parry, and lunge techniques, with targets identified as the throat, breast, and groin. French troops trained in formations they called elbow to elbow, specifically for maximum shock effect when they charged. British bayonet training emphasized what instructors called the spirit of the bayonet, which was essentially a program designed to teach soldiers to kill with cold steel while screaming at the top of their lungs. The idea was that if you could condition a man to charge at a straw-filled dummy with a steel blade while howling like a berserker, he would do the same when faced with a living, breathing enemy. The Russians, for their part, still believed in the power of mass bayonet charges, and their officer training manuals from the period read like something out of the Napoleonic era. Every major European army, without exception, believed that wars would be decided by infantry closing with the enemy and finishing the job with cold steel. Artillery would soften the enemy up, cavalry would scout and exploit, but it was the infantryman with his bayonet who would deliver the decisive blow. By the way, there was one German bayonet that would become quite controversial once the war started: the sawback bayonet. This was issued to pioneer and engineering units, and it had 29 double teeth along its spine for purely practical purposes like cutting brushwood, wire, and wood for gun positions. It was, in essence, a utility tool that happened to also be a blade. But when the Allies discovered them on the battlefield, they turned what was basically a tool into a symbol of Germanic barbarism, claiming that the intentionally serrated edge caused far worse wounds than ordinary bayonets. British and French propaganda made the sawback bayonet into a potent image of German atrocity, publishing lurid illustrations of the wounds it supposedly inflicted and using captured examples as evidence of the enemy's savage nature. The truth was that the sawback was actually counterproductive in combat, and likely to get caught in clothing and equipment rather than cutting cleanly. But that mattered little for propaganda purposes. German soldiers became so afraid of being captured with these bayonets that most were eventually recalled and had their teeth ground off before being reissued. Some German soldiers simply threw them away and replaced them with standard bayonets rather than risk being found with one. There were credible reports from both sides that soldiers captured with sawback bayonets were summarily executed on the spot, though the frequency of such incidents is difficult to verify. What is certain is that the sawback bayonet became one of the war's most effective propaganda tools, far more valuable for its impact on public opinion than it ever was as a weapon. But all of these bayonet designs, all of this training, all of these elaborate theories about the decisive bayonet charge were built on a fundamental assumption that was about to be violently disproved. The assumption was that infantry could actually cross the open ground between opposing forces and arrive in sufficient numbers to engage in hand-to-hand combat. That assumption had been questionable since at least the American Civil War, where rifled muskets and entrenched positions had produced casualty rates that horrified observers. It had been further challenged in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, where machine guns and quick-firing artillery had decimated attacking infantry with terrifying efficiency. European military observers had been present at those battles. They had written detailed reports about what they saw. And almost without exception, the generals who read those reports concluded that the lessons didn't apply to European armies. because European soldiers had better training, better morale, a more offensive spirit than the Japanese or the Russians. Going back to the story, the actual war began, and those generals were eager to prove just how right their tactics were. The mobilization plans clicked into motion with clockwork precision. Millions of men reported to their barracks, received their equipment, kissed their families goodbye, and boarded trains that would carry them to the frontiers. In every country, the atmosphere was almost festive. Young men worried not that they might die, but that the war would be over before they had a chance to prove themselves. The Kaiser told his soldiers they would be home before the leaves fell. French recruits chalked "à Berlin" on their railway cars. British volunteers sang on the troop ships crossing the Channel. Everyone expected a short, sharp, decisive war of movement and manoeuvre, the kind of war their textbooks had prepared them for. Well, spoiler alert, you already know how the fighting in the First World War would look after just the first couple months. The first of many catastrophes came in August 1914, when France launched the Great Offensive into German-held Alsace-Lorraine, the lost provinces that the entire offensive doctrine had been designed to recapture. This was the moment of truth for the philosophy of offensive à outrance. French soldiers advanced in those bright red trousers and blue coats with bands playing and flags flying, officers leading from the front with drawn swords in the manner of their Napoleonic ancestors. Regimental colours were uncased and carried forward. Bugles sounded the charge, and tens of thousands of French infantrymen surged toward the German positions with bayonets fixed and hearts full of the martial spirit that their commanders had told them would be the key to victory. And they marched directly into the killing zone of modern industrial warfare. German positions were protected by machine guns, barbed wire, and pre-registered artillery fields of fire. The Maxim gun, which could fire 600 rounds per minute, didn't care about your offensive spirit. It killed the brave and the cowardly with equal efficiency, and it could do so from a distance of over 1,000 yards. August 22nd, 1914, became the deadliest single day in French military history. In just one 24-hour period, 27,000 French soldiers were killed. Not wounded, killed. That was more than on any other single day in the entire history of French warfare, including the bloodiest days of Napoleon's campaigns, the Franco-Prussian War, and every colonial conflict France had ever fought. Some regiments lost over half their strength in a matter of hours. The 3rd Colonial Division was virtually annihilated in its attack on German positions at Rossignol, losing nearly 7,000 men in a single afternoon. Officers who led from the front with drawn swords were the first to die, and their replacements, less experienced and often terrified, struggled to maintain any semblance of order as the survivors fled back to their starting positions. So much for the revolutionary undefeatable tactic. Machine guns and artillery, coupled with barbed wire, mowed down infantry long before they could ever get close to bayonet range. The 6-foot spear rifle was useless against a weapon that could kill you from 1,000 yards away. The carefully trained bayonet techniques, the elbow-to-elbow formations, the spirit of the attack, all of it was meaningless when the attacking infantry was being cut to pieces by machine gun fire before they had covered half the distance to the enemy trenches. The red trousers made excellent targets. Then the Germans suffered their own catastrophe when they tried the same thing on a massive scale. During the First Battle of the Marne, Crown Prince Wilhelm ordered 100,000 German soldiers to fix bayonets and charge the French lines in darkness. It was supposed to be a devastating night attack that would shatter the French resistance through sheer shock and overwhelming numbers. But French 75mm guns opened fire into the packed grey ranks of German infantry. The French 75, formerly known as the Canon de 75 model 1897, was the finest field artillery piece in the world at the time. It could fire 15 aimed rounds per minute and had a hydro-pneumatic recoil system that allowed it to stay on target between shots, meaning the crew didn't have to re-aim after every round. When these guns opened up on massed infantry at close range, the effect was apocalyptic. German units panicked in the darkness in utter confusion. Communication broke down completely. Units lost contact with their neighbours, officers couldn't find their companies, and in the chaos, 2 German units fired on each other at almost point-blank range, each believing the other was the enemy. The assault suffered about 15,000 casualties, many of them from friendly fire, and achieved nothing. And these were just some of the similar outcomes of battles early in the war. The British suffered their own lessons at Mons and Le Cateau. The Russians were demolished at Tannenberg. The Austro-Hungarians lost catastrophically in Serbia and Galicia. Every single army that attacked discovered the same thing. Modern firepower had made frontal assault suicidal. The defense held every advantage. A few men behind a machine gun in a prepared position could hold off hundreds of attackers, and artillery could break up concentrations of troops before they even began their advance. And yet the generals kept ordering attacks, kept believing that the next one would be the one that broke through, kept sending their men forward into the same killing zones. All those failed offensives and broken charges led to attempts by both sides to outflank each other. If you couldn't break through the enemy's front, perhaps you could go around it. But there was a new factor in warfare that made this basically impossible. The first airplanes were now being used to provide aerial reconnaissance, which meant each side could actually see where the enemy was trying to go, around the end of the line, and could rush reserves by rail to block the move before it developed. With the firepower of new artillery and machine guns that were being used on such a scale for the first time, infantry charging across open ground was mowed down over and over again, and the survivors had nothing else to do but dig in wherever they stopped in order to survive. Each flanking attempt was met and blocked, and as the fighting moved northward, temporary defensive positions became permanent. In attack after attack during what became known as the Race to the Sea, neither side could outflank the other. The line kept extending northward through Picardy, Artois, Flanders, and finally reached the Belgian coast near Newport. And soon, both sides had settled into the trench warfare that would define the rest of the war. Opposing lines of trenches now snaked from the Belgian coast all the way to the Swiss border, creating 440 unbroken miles of fortification. A revolution in firepower had not been matched by similar advances in tactics or mobility. Armies could destroy anything they could see, but they couldn't move fast enough to exploit any temporary advantage before the defender shifted reserves to seal the breach. And this created a grueling form of warfare where the defender held every advantage. There were no flanks to turn anymore. Every attack now had to be frontal, directly into prepared defensive positions where machine guns, artillery, barbed wire, and deep dugouts waited to consume anything that moved across the open ground. The trench systems themselves grew in complexity as the months passed. What had started as shallow scrapes in the dirt, hastily dug by exhausted soldiers trying to survive, evolved into elaborate underground fortifications that stretched for miles in depth. A typical trench system consisted of 3 parallel lines. The frontline trench, also called the fire trench, was where the soldiers lived and fought. Behind it, usually 70 to 100 yards back, was the support trench, which held reserves and provided a fallback position. Further back still, perhaps 400 to 600 yards behind the front line, was the reserve trench, where additional troops waited and where command posts, first aid stations, and supply dumps were located. These 3 lines were connected by communication trenches that ran perpendicular to the front, allowing men and supplies to move forward and wounded to be evacuated without exposing themselves to enemy fire. The frontline trenches were designed not just for fighting, but for survival under constant bombardment. They zigzagged back and forth in a pattern called traverses, which broke the trench into a series of short, straight sections connected by sharp turns. This design served a critical defensive purpose. If a trench ran straight for any distance, a single shell landing inside could send shrapnel and blast down the entire length, killing everyone inside. The zigzag pattern meant that a blast would be contained to just that one bay and a few unfortunate soldiers in it. But because of all those twists and turns, soldiers could typically see no more than about 30 feet ahead of them at any given time, which would become critically important when raiders came calling in the dark. The front wall of the trench facing the enemy was called the parapet, and it was built up with sandbags, logs, and whatever other material was available to provide both protection and a firing step where soldiers could stand to shoot over the top. The rear wall, called the parados, was also reinforced to protect against shells that overshot the trench. The floor was typically lined with wooden duckboards to keep the soldiers' feet above the standing water that collected at the bottom, though in the worst sectors, particularly in Flanders where the water table was only a few feet below the surface, the water was a permanent companion that no amount of duckboarding could defeat. Over 4 million men had been killed or wounded in just the first 5 months of the war. 4 million in 5 months. The scale of the carnage was beyond anything that even the most pessimistic pre-war planners had imagined, and the front line had barely moved. The great offensives that were supposed to end the war by Christmas had accomplished nothing except filling vast cemeteries with young men who had been promised a quick and glorious victory. So now what happens when everything that was thought before suddenly proves catastrophically wrong and is getting thousands upon thousands of soldiers killed? When the doctrines you've built your entire military around turn out to be not just ineffective, but actively suicidal? When the weapons you've designed for one kind of war are useless in the war you're actually fighting? Well, the answer would eventually lie not in advancing weapons and tactics, but rather in going back to medieval times of swords and body armor. Believe it or not, the most technologically advanced war the world had ever seen would produce a return to the most primitive forms of combat, because the technology itself had created conditions where those primitive methods were the only ones that worked. But first, the obvious question for commanders was how to break through these trench lines, and the answer, at least according to military thinking of the time, was artillery. The logic seemed straightforward. You would bombard the enemy trenches for days, sometimes even a full week, pulverizing everything in front of you. The artillery would destroy the barbed wire, collapse the trenches, kill or demoralize the defenders, and knock out their machine guns. Then your infantry would simply walk across no man's land and occupy what was left of the enemy positions. That was the theory anyway. And if it didn't work the first time, the obvious conclusion was that you hadn't used enough artillery. So you would use more next time, and more the time after that. But it didn't work like that at all. The most notorious example came at the Somme, where the British fired over 1.5 million shells during a 7-day bombardment that was supposed to annihilate the German defences. The noise was so loud it could be heard in London. Commanders were so confident in the effectiveness of this bombardment that they ordered soldiers not to run but to walk across no man's land, just to maintain discipline and formation, because the Germans would surely all be dead after such a bombardment anyway. Some officers even had their men kick footballs across no man's land to demonstrate how casual and certain the advance would be. Well, that optimism proved catastrophically misplaced, and the Somme is remembered, as you know, as the deadliest day in British military history. The Germans had built deep dugouts, some of them 40 feet underground, reinforced with concrete, timber and steel. These weren't just holes in the ground. They were underground barracks with electric lighting, ventilation systems, bunk beds and ammunition storage. The soldiers inside could simply wait out even the heaviest bombardment in relative safety, playing cards, sleeping, writing letters home, and then scramble back to their firing positions the moment the barrage lifted and mow down the soldiers walking across the open ground. On July 1st, 1916, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, of whom roughly 20,000 were killed. Many units were virtually annihilated in the first minutes of the attack. The Newfoundland Regiment at Beaumont Hamel advanced into withering machine gun fire and suffered 90% casualties in less than 30 minutes. The Tyneside Irish Brigade lost over 80% of its men before reaching the German front line. And for some reason, this was so hard for the commanders to understand, and they would send wave after wave after wave of soldiers going over the top and dying without any real success. Even if they managed to capture some section of enemy trenches, there were always 2 or 3 more lines behind it, and the attacking force would be so badly beaten up while taking the first line that they would inevitably lose it in the enemy counterattack that came within hours. Everything would be right back where it started after a day or two, with nothing accomplished except thousands of men dying. The Battle of the Somme ground on for nearly 5 months, from July to November 1916, and when it finally ended, the British and French had advanced a maximum of 7 miles along a 15-mile front. The cost was staggering. The British suffered approximately 420,000 casualties. The French lost around 200,000. German casualties were estimated at between 465,000 and 600,000, depending on the source. All of this for a few miles of churned-up, shell-cratered wasteland that had no particular strategic value. And the Somme was just one example. Verdun, which began in February 1916 and lasted until December, consumed approximately 700,000 casualties between the two sides, French and German, in a battle that moved the front line barely a few hundred yards in either direction. The French called it the mincing machine because it ground up men like meat. the battles of Ypres, Arras, Champagne, Luz, Vimy, the Aisne, Passchendaele. The list goes on, each one producing hundreds of thousands of casualties for gains that could barely be measured on a map. Passchendaele, officially the third battle of Ypres, which ran from July to November 1917, cost approximately 475,000 British and 220,000 German casualties for an advance of about 5 miles through some of the most atrocious conditions human beings have ever been asked to fight in. Men drowned in the mud of Passchendaele. They sank into shell craters filled with liquid mud and rainwater and simply disappeared. Mules, horses, artillery pieces, even tanks vanished into the morass. The battlefield was so saturated that the dead could not be buried. They simply sank into the ground and became part of the landscape. So with these massive frontal assaults proving so catastrophically useless, another approach began to emerge. Small-scale raids, hit-and-run attacks at night, not designed to break through the line and hold territory, but simply to slip in, accomplish specific objectives and slip back out again before the enemy could respond in force. There were some early experiments happening almost as soon as the trenches formed. Individual soldiers and small groups had been crawling out into no man's land almost from the beginning, sometimes on their own initiative, to gather intelligence, snipe at enemy positions, or simply to see what the other side was doing. But the tactic really came together with the Canadians, and you're about to hear why hand-to-hand combat in the First World War was much different and significantly more horrific than what soldiers had trained for. Before we get into the trench raiders themselves, first take a look at the conditions in which they're about to be fighting and how their armament went back several centuries in history, because understanding the physical environment of the trenches is essential to understanding why trench raiding was both necessary and so extraordinarily dangerous. Frontline trenches were typically about 7 feet deep and 6 feet wide, with 2 to 3 feet of sandbags on top. German trenches were often deeper, reaching 10 to 12 feet with timber or concrete supports, because the Germans, who were generally on the defensive on the Western Front, invested far more effort in making their positions comfortable and durable than the British or French, who officially regarded their trenches as temporary and expected to be attacking out of them at any moment. The German approach to trench construction reflected a very different philosophy. They weren't planning to leave anytime soon, and they built accordingly, with deep dugouts, concrete reinforcement, drainage systems, and even electric lighting in some sectors. And all trenches were built in zigzag or jagged patterns on purpose, as I mentioned. But because of those twists and turns, visibility inside the trench was severely limited. A soldier standing at one point in the trench could typically see no more than about 30 feet in either direction before the next traverse blocked his view. This meant that enemies could be just around the corner and you wouldn't know it until you turned that corner. In daylight, this was manageable. At night, when a raiding party dropped silently into your trench, it was terrifying. You could hear sounds of fighting, screams, explosions, but you couldn't see what was happening because every section of trench was isolated by those protective angles. You didn't know if the raiders were coming toward you or moving away. You didn't know how many there were. You didn't know if the man coming around the next traverse was your friend or someone who wanted to kill you. Now, in these cramped, twisting corridors, the infantry rifles that armies had spent decades making longer with what were basically swords attached to them rather than bayonets, suddenly became the main problem. A 6-foot-long weapon is magnificent for an open-field bayonet charge. It is catastrophically impractical in a 6-foot-wide trench with 90-degree turns every 30 feet. Bolt-action rifles that were designed for shooting at enemies 300 yards away were basically useless when fighting happened within arm's reach. You couldn't aim them, you couldn't swing them, you could barely maneuver them in the confined space. The long bayonet that was supposed to give you the advantage of reach now gave you the disadvantage of being unable to turn corners without getting the whole assembly jammed against the trench walls. Another problem was that bayonets would often get stuck in bodies. This is something that the training manuals didn't spend much time discussing, but it was a brutal reality of bayonet combat. When you drove 20 inches of steel into a human body, the blade could become trapped by bone, muscle contraction, and the suction created by the wound cavity. One Australian soldier described watching a fellow soldier who drove his bayonet through a German and then into a hardwood beam behind him, and he just couldn't pull it out. The bayonet had to be released from the rifle, leaving the German stuck there where the poor guy died, pinned to the wall, like a mounted specimen. There were even cases where two soldiers were found dead, having stabbed each other with their bayonets at the exact same moment, locked together in a final embrace of mutual destruction. Through these horrible situations, soldiers on both sides quickly figured out that a long rifle with a bayonet just wasn't the right tool for close quarters battle in the trenches. So they reached for clubs, knives, and sharpened shovels, weapons that would have been perfectly familiar to their medieval ancestors. The irony was extraordinary. Here they were, fighting in the most technologically advanced war in human history, surrounded by machine guns, poison gas, aircraft, and artillery that could fire shells 10 miles behind the lines, and the most effective weapons for the kind of fighting that actually mattered in the trenches were the same weapons that men had been using since the Bronze Age. Trench clubs became the weapon of choice for night raids. And the ingenuity that soldiers applied to their construction tells you something about what happens to human beings when they're placed in desperate circumstances. They had some creative designs, often improvised from whatever materials were available in the trenches. Some were made from the empty metal casings of Mills bombs fixed to wooden handles, creating a heavy, compact striking weapon that could cave in a skull with a single blow. Others took the handles from their entrenching tools and added lead weights, then drove hobnails all around the head so that every strike would tear flesh as well as break bone. Some looked like morning stars from the Middle Ages with iron spikes projecting in every direction, and these were made by combat engineers who had access to blacksmithing equipment behind the lines. There were even clubs with flexible wire coils connecting the head to the handle for extra striking power, essentially medieval flails recreated with industrial materials. Officers and senior NCOs sometimes commissioned custom-made trench clubs from artisans in the rear areas, and some of these weapons were genuinely works of craftsmanship, with leather-wrapped handles, balanced heads, and wrist straps to prevent them being dropped in the chaos of a raid. Museums today hold hundreds of these weapons, and each one tells a story of a man who realized that the rifle he'd been issued was worse than useless for the job he was being asked to do. So much about the modern way of fighting. Trench knives soon came in all kinds of varieties. The French developed the nail knife, a simple, spike-like weapon that could be drawn quickly and used in the tightest spaces. The British issued the Mark I trench knife with a double-edged blade and a crossguard, but the most famous trench knife was definitely the American Mark I with brass knuckles built into the handle and spikes on them to stop an enemy from grabbing your knife hand. The bottom of the handle extended into what they called a skull crusher cap, a heavy flat steel plate designed for exactly the purpose its name implies. So you can imagine how it worked. You could slash with the blade, punch with the knuckles, spike with the handguard, or hammer with the pommel. It was 4 weapons in one, and it was designed by men who understood exactly what close-quarters trench fighting demanded. These knives were issued completely blackened to prevent any glinting in moonlight that might give away a raider's position. Even the blade was treated with a chemical solution to eliminate its natural shine. Every detail was thought through with one purpose in mind: silent, efficient killing in the dark. But among all these improvised and purpose-built weapons, the shovel proved to be the most effective of all. The standard entrenching tool, a short-handled spade that every soldier carried as basic equipment, turned out to be the ideal trench-fighting weapon. It was much better for striking because of its weight and broad head, and soldiers sharpened the edges so it would create a devastating effect on the human body wherever you hit someone. A sharpened entrenching tool could take off a man's hand, split his skull, or open wounds that no field hospital could repair. And unlike the bayonet, it wouldn't get stuck. The broad flat blade would strike and release cleanly, allowing the wielder to immediately follow up with another blow. German stormtroopers would later make the sharpened spade their signature close combat weapon, and Erich Maria Remarque described it in vivid detail in his novel about the war. The spade became so associated with trench fighting that it was almost a symbol of the war's regression from modern warfare to medieval butchery. Now, this return to medieval times went beyond just weapons. It extended to armour as well. The devastating effect of shrapnel and bullet fragments led all sides to experiment with body protection that would have looked right at home on a 15th century night. The Germans first issued body armour, in the form of a steel breastplate called the Sappenpanzer. However, the steel breastplate weighed over 20 pounds, so it was only practical for sentries and machine gunners in stationary positions, not troops who had to run and fight in them. A sentry standing watch over no man's land for hours could benefit from the protection, but a raider crawling on his belly through mud and wire would be dangerously encumbered by the weight. Despite its limitations, the Sappenpanzer did save lives. There are documented cases of soldiers surviving multiple rifle hits thanks to the plate, and machine gunners behind the breastplate could continue firing even when taking fire themselves. But for mobile infantry, it was impractical. The British experimented with their own body armour designs, including the Dayfield body shield and various privately purchased vests that officers could buy from London outfitters. Some of these were made of overlapping steel scales, others of densely woven silk that could supposedly stop a low-velocity pistol round. The quality varied enormously, and many soldiers who bought these shields discovered too late that they offered far less protection than advertised. The Americans experimented quite a bit with the Brewster body shield, a 40-pound monstrosity made of chrome nickel steel that could actually stop a rifle round, but it was everything but practical. The thing was so heavy and cumbersome that the soldier wearing it could barely move, let alone fight. Testing showed that a man in a Brewster shield couldn't climb over a trench parapet, couldn't crawl, and couldn't move faster than a slow walk. It was never used on the battlefield, though photographs of soldiers posing in them make for some of the most surreal images of the war. Helmets, however, proved their worth immediately and became standard equipment on all sides. The French Adrian helmet, introduced in 1915, was the first modern steel helmet issued to troops in significant numbers. The British Brodie helmet followed, with its distinctive wide brim designed to protect against shrapnel falling from above. The German Stahlhelm, introduced in 1916, provided the best protection of all, with its extended brim at the front and sides and its unique coal scuttle shape that covered the temples and the back of the neck. Statistical analysis showed that the introduction of steel helmets reduced head wound casualties by approximately 75%, making them one of the most effective pieces of equipment introduced during the entire war. The Stahlhelm's design was so effective that it influenced military helmet design for decades afterward, and its basic shape is still recognizable in modern combat helmets. Now that you understand why these medieval weapons came back, let's go into the raids and how they performed in practice. The logic of trench raiding was sound, even if its execution was horrifying. A handful of men crawling through the darkness could get past the machine guns that would have mowed down a mass assault. They didn't need to cut through barbed wire across an entire front, just find or make a single path through it. They didn't need to overrun a whole trench system, just get into a specific section, do what they came to do, and get out. And because they operated at night without those massive artillery bombardments announcing their arrival, they could actually achieve surprise in a way that the big attacks never could. The raiders relied on stealth, speed, and controlled violence, rather than the brute force that had produced such catastrophic results in the set-piece battles. But this was only if everything went according to plan, which was rare. While all armies eventually developed trench raiding, the Canadians elevated it to an art form and became the experts in violent nighttime trips into enemy territory. The Canadians had several advantages that made them particularly effective raiders. Many Canadian soldiers came from rural backgrounds, hunters and trappers and lumberjacks who were comfortable moving quietly through rough terrain in the dark. They were volunteers rather than conscripts, at least until 1917, which meant they were generally more motivated and aggressive than average. And the Canadian Corps developed a culture of innovation and professionalism that encouraged officers and NCOs to develop new tactics and share successful techniques across units. The first major organised trench raid of the war happened on February 28, 1915, when 100 men of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry attacked German positions near St. Eloi in Belgium. This wasn't a spontaneous action. It was a carefully planned operation with specific objectives, rehearsals, and coordination with supporting artillery. The raiders moved out of their trenches after dark, crawled across no man's land, cut through the wire, and dropped into the German trench. In a brief but savage engagement, they destroyed 30 yards of German trenches while the raid cost 5 killed, 7 wounded, and 2 missing. By the standards of the Western Front, where major attacks routinely produced thousands of casualties for no gain at all, this was a remarkable result. It demonstrated that small groups of determined men could achieve tactical objectives at a fraction of the cost of conventional assaults. The Canadians made another big raid on Petit Douve Farm when 170 volunteers prepared for 10 days with scout patrols, training, and rehearsals. The preparation was meticulous. Scouts went out nightly to map the wire obstacles, identify sentry positions, and find the best approach routes. The raiding party rehearsed the operation repeatedly on a full-scale mock-up of the objective built behind their own lines. Each man knew exactly where he was supposed to go, what he was supposed to do, and how long he had to do it. Artillery shelled the enemy wire beforehand to create gaps while raiders stripped off anything that could identify them if captured, including dog tags, pay books, shoulder patches, and letters from home. The theory was that if you were captured or killed, the enemy shouldn't be able to figure out which unit you belonged to, because that information had intelligence value. At 2:30 in the morning on November 17th, they attacked. They achieved complete surprise because the German sentries had taken cover from the rain and weren't watching no man's land as carefully as they should have been. In just 20 minutes, they killed around 30 Germans and captured 12 prisoners along with valuable intelligence, including new rubber gas masks that British chemical warfare specialists were desperate to examine. The casualties were only one man killed, and that was by accidental friendly fire, plus one slightly wounded. It was a textbook operation, and it established the template that other Canadian raids would follow throughout the war. You see, the objectives of these raids weren't really about taking ground. The most common purpose was intelligence gathering, capturing prisoners who could be questioned to find out which units were facing you, whether reinforcements were being brought in, what the enemy's morale was like, and whether an attack was being planned. A single captured soldier could provide information that aerial reconnaissance and signals intelligence couldn't. He could tell you about conditions in the trenches, about supply problems, about the quality and experience of his unit, and about his commander's intentions. A captured map or set of orders was even more valuable, and raiders were trained to search bodies and dugouts for documents as quickly as possible before withdrawing. Raiders also tried to destroy valuable equipment like machine guns, wreck dugouts, blow up ammunition stores, cut communication wires, and simply kill as many enemy soldiers as possible to wear down their numbers and degrade their fighting capability. Every machine gun destroyed in a raid was one fewer machine gun that would be firing at your infantry during the next daylight attack. Every experienced NCO killed in a night raid weakened the enemy's leadership structure and couldn't be easily replaced. Beyond the practical value, there was also a psychological reason for raiding. High Command believed that constant raiding kept the troops aggressive and alert, maintaining what they called the offensive spirit. Generals who couldn't figure out how to break through the trench lines still wanted their men to be doing something offensive. Even if it was on a tiny scale, and raiding fit the bill perfectly. It kept the troops active, it generated intelligence, it caused casualties to the enemy, and it demonstrated that the army was still on the attack, even when the front line wasn't moving. And there was another purpose that was darker and more cynical. In many sectors, soldiers on both sides had developed what became known as a live and let live system. Basically, informal truces where both sides quietly agreed not to shoot to kill. There were agreements not to shell the latrines or attack during breakfast. Machine gunners would fire at the same times every day, aiming at the same empty spots, creating a pattern that both sides understood and respected. Snipers would deliberately miss. Working parties repairing wire in no man's land would be left alone, as long as they weren't obviously preparing for an attack. These arrangements horrified the senior officers and generals who saw them as evidence that their soldiers were losing the will to fight. Officers used trench raids deliberately to break these arrangements and force their men back into active fighting. Once a raid had been conducted against an enemy position, any informal truce in that sector was dead. The enemy would retaliate, often with a raid of their own, and the cycle of violence would resume. Before going over the top, raiders blackened their faces with burnt cork, boot polish, or brown grease to eliminate the pale gleam of skin in moonlight or starlight. They wore thick rubber gloves to handle barbed wire silently and protect their hands from the razor-sharp barbs that could cut flesh to the bone. All rattling gear and shiny objects were stripped off. Metal buttons were wrapped in cloth. Bayonet scabbards were tied to the legs so they wouldn't swing and clang. Water bottles were emptied or secured, and anything that might reflect light or make noise was removed, covered, or left behind. Some raiders removed their boots and went over in socks or wrapped their feet in sandbag material for absolute silence. Others wore soft-soled shoes or moccasins. The blackened faces, the dark clothing, the silence, the medieval weapons, all of it combined to create something that looked less like a modern military operation and more like a scene from a nightmare. Raiders carried those weapons we mentioned, optimized for close-up silent killing. Clubs, knives, sharpened shovels, knuckle dusters, koshes, blackjacks, brass knuckles, and whatever else a soldier could improvise or scrounge. Then, when silence no longer mattered, when the element of surprise had been lost and the trench erupted into chaos, they used bombs and pistols. Mills bombs, the British hand grenades with their distinctive pineapple shape, were ideal for clearing dugouts and killing men around corners without exposing yourself. Pistols, particularly revolvers that wouldn't jam in muddy conditions, were preferred for their reliability and their ability to be fired with one hand while the other held a knife or club. And operations were timed to a maximum of 20 minutes, so they could hopefully slip back across no man's land before the enemy reinforcements would arrive from neighbouring sections of the trench and from the support and reserve lines behind. 20 minutes was the generally accepted window. After that, the risks increased exponentially. The longer you stayed in the enemy's trench, the more likely it was that you would be overwhelmed, cut off, and killed or captured. Now, actually carrying out a trench raid was an extremely dangerous and complicated business, and the raiders had a whole series of obstacles that could get them killed at any stage of the operation, from the moment they climbed over their own parapet to the moment they hopefully tumbled back into it at the end. The first challenge was simply crossing no man's land, which was usually several hundred yards across, though in some places it could be as narrow as 30 feet. The terrain itself was a nightmare of mud and shell craters, littered with debris, rotting corpses, unexploded ordnance, and tangles of barbed wire. In the worst sectors, no man's land was a lunar landscape of overlapping craters filled with stagnant water, mud, decomposing bodies, and toxic chemicals from gas attacks. The stench was overwhelming. The ground was unstable, with shell-loosened earth that could give way under a man's weight and send him sliding into a crater full of foul water and worse. The great thing, as one soldier put it, was patience. If you went slow enough and kept on your belly, you couldn't be heard or seen. Speed was the enemy during the approach. A man who tried to move too quickly through no man's land would rustle the grass, scrape against debris, splash in puddles, and create movement that alert sentries could detect. The successful raider moved inches at a time, feeling the ground ahead with his hands before placing his weight on it. The wire was a major obstacle. Barbed wire wasn't a single strand that you could step over. It was sometimes 30 feet wide and 5 or 6 feet tall, with multiple rows of iron stakes and strand upon strand of barbed wire woven into a nearly impenetrable barrier. Some wire was erected in concertina patterns, coiled spirals that tangled around anything that touched them. Others were straight strand installations supported by corkscrew pickets driven silently into the ground to avoid the noise of hammering. Some defensive wire had empty tins hung on them with pebbles inside that would rattle and give warning if anyone touched it. Other wire was electrified, though this was relatively uncommon because it required power lines that were vulnerable to shell fire. Wire-cutting parties would sometimes go out nights before the raid to cut paths through the wire, so the raiding party would spend less time in the open on the night of the actual operation. This was itself extremely dangerous work. Wire cutters had to lie in no man's land for hours, sometimes just yards from the enemy trench, snipping individual strands of wire and gently moving them aside without creating the metallic ping that wire makes when it's cut under tension. Some cutters learned to place their hands around the wire to muffle the sound, accepting the cuts and lacerations to their palms and fingers as the price of silence. Others used specially modified wire cutters with rubber-coated handles and sharpened jaws that could cut wire with minimal noise. The Germans, learning that their wire was being cut, began sending out patrols specifically to ambush wire-cutting parties, which turned the already dangerous job into something approaching suicide. At any moment during the crossing, raiders faced the terrifying possibility of illumination. Both sides used star shells, which were artillery rounds that burst at a certain height and deployed a magnesium flare hanging from a small parachute. When one went up, it blazed brightly for a minute or more, lighting up no man's land like midday sun with a harsh white light that cast sharp black shadows and eliminated every scrap of concealment. The Germans also used pistol flares fired from very pistols that gave light for 10 or 15 seconds. The instant raiders saw a flare going up, they would freeze, not daring to move until the light died. Any movement caught in the glare would bring down machine gun fire immediately. The trick was to freeze in position the instant you saw the flare being fired before the light fully bloomed, because the human eye is attracted to movement, and a man lying perfectly still in no man's land was extremely difficult to spot, even in bright illumination, while a man caught in mid-movement was obvious. One veteran explained that you had to keep your head down and your eyes closed because if you watched the light, your eyes would reflect it and the enemy sentries looking into the darkness would spot you more easily. You just lay there with your face pressed into the mud, hearing your own heart pounding, waiting for the light to fade, waiting for the machine guns to either open up or stay silent. Then the next thing to take care of were the sentries. Both sides kept listening posts out in no man's land, in front of the main trench line, specifically to detect enemy parties. These were usually small saps, short dead-end trenches dug forward from the front line where 2 or 3 soldiers would sit in the darkness, listening for the sounds of movement in no man's land. If they spotted anything suspicious, they would immediately raise the alarm with a flare or a whistle, and the whole front would erupt with fire directed into no man's land. So raiders had to find these listening posts and either avoid them entirely, taking a longer route around them, or silence them. Standard practice was to creep slowly up on the sentries and then kill them as quietly as possible in the silence of the night. This meant using a knife or a club rather than a firearm, and it meant getting close enough to touch the man before he knew you were there. This was among the most psychologically demanding tasks that any soldier could be asked to perform, killing a man at arm's length in cold blood, silently, in the dark. Enemy patrols were another danger. Both sides sent men out into no man's land at night for reconnaissance, wire repair and raiding, so there was always a chance that a raiding party would run into an enemy patrol doing the same thing going the other direction. These encounters could turn into desperate hand-to-hand battles in the shell holes and craters of no man's land, fought with knives and fists and teeth in total darkness, with neither side able to call for help because doing so would bring down fire on everyone. Raiders and patrols also learned that when the enemy wasn't firing any shots and wasn't sending up any flares, it often meant that they also had a patrol out somewhere nearby and didn't want to illuminate their own men. When 2 patrols of opposing sides accidentally met in no man's land, they sometimes let each other pass without fighting because they both knew that if someone started shooting, the whole front section would open up and nobody was coming back to their own line alive. Though sometimes the encounter was too sudden and too close for restraint, and the fighting was as savage as anything that happened in the trenches themselves. Once the raiders actually reached the enemy trench and dropped inside, the brutal and up-close fighting began immediately. Every second spent in the enemy trench was another second for enemy soldiers in neighbouring sections to grab their weapons and come running, so they had to make it count. The raiding party had typically been divided into specific groups before the operation, each with a designated role. There was usually a blocking group whose job was to position themselves at the traverses on either end of the targeted section of trench and hold those positions against any enemy soldiers trying to get in. They would set up with grenades and pistols, and their orders were simple. Nothing gets past you. The main assault group would then work through the targeted section of trench, clearing each base systematically. They used the chaos and confusion, killed as many soldiers as they could, threw grenades into dugouts, destroyed equipment, and if possible, captured prisoners. A prisoner-snatching team would grab 1 or 2 enemy soldiers, bind them quickly, and prepare to drag them back across no man's land. Taking prisoners alive in the middle of a trench fight was incredibly difficult because the prisoner would naturally resist, and because the men doing the grabbing had to do it without getting killed by the prisoner's comrades who were fighting just yards away. Sometimes raiders simply knocked a prisoner unconscious with a club blow and carried him back over their shoulders. There was also usually a demolition team whose job was to destroy specific targets, machine gun positions, observation posts, dugout entrances, communication trenches. They carried explosive charges, detonators and fuses, and they had to set and detonate their charges while the fighting raged around them. The entire operation had to be completed within that 20-minute window, and the assault leader carried a luminous dial watch and was responsible for calling the withdrawal at the appointed time, whether the mission objectives had been accomplished or not. Then the return journey was usually the most dangerous part of all. The raiders were now moving quickly, possibly dragging unwilling prisoners or wounded comrades through no man's land back to their own lines. The element of surprise was gone. The enemy knew they were out there. Machine guns and artillery could sweep across no man's land at any moment, and the raiders, burdened with prisoners and casualties, couldn't move as quickly or quietly as they had on the way out. In all that chaos and darkness, many raiders got disoriented, lost their sense of direction, and jumped into a trench with a sense of relief, only to realize they had made a terrible mistake. They had come back to the enemy trench, where the soldiers inside weren't quite happy to see them. This happened more often than you might think, because no man's land at night, in the rain, under fire, with flares going up and shells exploding, was a featureless nightmare where every direction looked the same. Friendly fire was another concern on the return. Even if nothing else had killed you somehow, the sentries in your own trench knew a raiding party was out. But in the confusion of darkness and incoming fire, it was easy for an understandably nervous man to shoot at shapes coming over the parapet, especially if those shapes were moving quickly and irregularly, which is exactly how returning raiders moved when they were under fire. Password systems were set up so returning raiders could identify themselves when challenged, hopefully. But then sometimes the sentry was relieved during the raid, and the new one didn't get the information about the raiding party that might be coming back in a few hours. Or the password was shouted but not heard over the noise of gunfire, or the returning raider was so disoriented and panicked that he forgot the password entirely. Several documented incidents exist of raiding parties taking casualties from their own sentries on the return. And all of this effort, all of this risk was for objectives that often seemed trivial to the men who were dying doing them. The officers 30 miles behind the lines wanted to know what was going on the opposite side, so they simply ordered someone to go and take a look. A brigadier general sitting in a comfortable chateau with maps spread on his dining table would decide that he needed to know which German division was holding the sector opposite his brigade, and that decision would translate into an order that sent 24 men crawling through the dark to kill and be killed for a scrap of information that might or might not prove useful. Many trench raiding operations were never mentioned outside of battalion command diaries because the men simply went out and none of them ever returned. Entire raiding parties vanished into no man's land without a trace, their fate known only from the sound of gunfire and grenades that was heard from the direction of the enemy trenches, followed by silence. And even if the raid was successful without many casualties, it would likely only bring retaliation the following night. The enemy, stung by a raid, would organize their own raid in response, and the cycle of violence would escalate until both sides were sending out raiding parties almost nightly, each one avenging the last one, each one producing casualties that provoked the next one. Armies gradually developed purpose-built weapons for trench fighting as the limitations of standard issue equipment became impossible to ignore. The pistol, which had previously been just a secondary weapon or something that officers carried as a badge of rank, became essential for raiding parties. The British Webley revolver worked well in mud, but it only held 6 rounds, and reloading a revolver in the dark in the middle of a fight with muddy and possibly bleeding hands was no easy task. The Colt M1911 semi-automatic was highly prized by the Americans for its stopping power and its 7-round magazine that could be changed quickly, while the Germans had their Luger P08, an elegant weapon but one that was notoriously unreliable in muddy conditions because its toggle lock mechanism was sensitive to dirt and grit. The MP18 was the real breakthrough for trench fighting, the weapon that changed everything. Designed by Hugo Schmeisser and manufactured by Bergmann, it was the world's first practical submachine gun. Chambered in 9mm parabellum, firing at about 400 rounds per minute from a 32-round drum magazine, it gave German stormtroopers devastating firepower in the tight spaces of trenches. A single man with an MP18 could lay down more firepower in a trench bay than an entire squad armed with bolt-action rifles. It was compact enough to use around corners, light enough to carry while running, and powerful enough to kill at the ranges that trench fighting demanded, which were rarely more than 30 or 40 feet. Only about 3,000 actually saw frontline combat before the armistice. But the MP18 proved the concept worked, and it set the pattern for most submachine guns that came after it, including the Thompson, the Sten, the MP40, and the PPSH-41 that would see such extensive use in the next war. The American contribution to trench weapons was the infamous Winchester model 1897 trench shotgun. The most interesting thing you've surely heard about this gun was what they called slam fire. Unlike modern pump-action shotguns, the M1897 didn't have a trigger disconnector, which meant it fired every time the action closed as long as the trigger was held down. A trained soldier could simply hold the trigger back and pump the action as fast as he could, and the gun would fire every time the slide reached its forward position. All 6 shells could be emptied in about 2 seconds, sending a storm of buckshot down a trench bay that was impossible not to hit a large number of enemy soldiers with. Each shell contained 9.33 caliber lead pellets, so 6 shells fired in 2 seconds put 54 lead balls into a space roughly 6 feet wide. The effect on human bodies at that range was devastating. It worked so well that the German government formally protested against the use of shotguns, threatening to execute soldiers captured with them or even shotgun shells, arguing that they caused unnecessary suffering under the Hague Conventions. The Germans were then reminded of their own flamethrowers and poisonous gases as examples of weapons that actually caused unnecessary suffering, and were told that if they retaliated against soldiers captured with shotguns, the response would be much worse. The protest was quietly dropped, though German soldiers continued to despise the shotgun throughout the war, and there were isolated reports of prisoners found with shotgun shells being treated more harshly than those without. The close-quarters killing in the trenches also forced armies to develop proper hand-to-hand combat training that went far beyond the simple bayonet drill that had been the standard before the war. Programs in jiu-jitsu, boxing and wrestling were implemented on all sides. The British Army brought in professional boxers and wrestling champions to teach soldiers how to fight without weapons, how to disarm an enemy, how to use an opponent's momentum against him, and how to kill quickly and quietly with bare hands. The French developed their own close combat system called close combat methods, which drew on savate, the traditional French kickboxing art, as well as knife-fighting techniques that had been passed down through generations of colonial warfare. The Germans, characteristically systematic, developed a comprehensive close combat training program that was integrated into their stormtrooper schools and that covered everything from knife fighting to grenade throwing to the use of entrenching tools as weapons. As the war ground on, both sides began to realize that small-scale raiding, while useful for intelligence gathering and keeping the troops active, would never win the war by itself. What was needed was a way to apply those same principles of speed, surprise, and close-quarters violence on a much larger scale, to use the tactics of the trench raid not just to snatch a prisoner or destroy a machine gun, but to actually break through the enemy line and restore the war of movement that had ended in 1914. And that is exactly what the Germans set out to create with their Sturmbataillone, their storm battalions, the formations that would take the concept of the trench raider and transform it into something far more ambitious and far more deadly. The creation of the German stormtroopers, or Stoßtruppen as they were officially designated, didn't happen overnight. It was an evolutionary process driven by the brutal lessons of the battlefield and shaped by a handful of innovative officers who were willing to throw out the old playbook and write a new one from scratch. While the British were secretly building tanks to break the stalemate of trench warfare, the Germans took a far more radical path, creating a new breed of soldiers whose deeds would haunt every man who heard about them. The idea that small, specially trained parties could achieve what mass attacks could not had been percolating through the German army almost from the beginning of trench warfare. But turning that idea into a coherent tactical doctrine required someone with the vision and the stubbornness to make it work. In March 1915, the German High Command experimented with the concept on a larger scale by forming Kalso's assault detachment, known in German as Sturmabteilung Kalso. It was an experimental unit of pioneers equipped with unusual gear like bulletproof shields and body armour intended to protect the men from rifle and machine gun fire as they advanced across no man's land. The concept looked good on paper. Soldiers wearing steel breastplates and carrying portable shields would be able to cross the killing ground that had stopped every conventional attack, reach the enemy trench, and overwhelm the defenders. But before the unit could even properly test this idea in the way it was intended, it was thrown in as emergency reinforcements during a major Allied assault near Ypres, during which half of the detachment was killed in conventional fighting that their equipment wasn't designed for. The body armour proved too heavy for fast movement, and the shields, while they could stop bullets, restricted the soldiers' ability to fight, effectively once they reached the enemy trench. But the idea didn't die. Although only the newly introduced Stahlhelm steel helmet would survive into future use, while body armour was discarded, the concept of specially trained assault troops remained very much alive. Command of the battered unit was passed to Captain Willie Raw, a professional soldier with a keen tactical mind and a willingness to experiment. Raw reorganized the detachment completely and reinforced it with a dedicated machine gun platoon, a flamethrower section, and troops armed and trained specifically for brutal close combat. He threw out everything that didn't work and kept everything that did, building a unit from the ground up around the principle that speed, aggression, and tactical flexibility were more important than mass and firepower. Weapons they carried were chosen or modified to be effective in the cramped spaces of trenches. Light machine guns that could be carried forward during an attack, rather than the heavy water-cooled models that needed to be set up on tripods. Flamethrowers that could clear a trench bay in seconds, sacks full of stick grenades that became the stormtroopers' signature weapon. Pistols, carbines, shortened rifles, entrenching tools sharpened to a razor's edge, and trench knives of every description. Raw's reformed unit became the prototype for the stormtroopers to come. Their first real test came in a planned assault on a French position in the Vosges Mountains in October 1915. The attack was short and surgical, completely unlike anything that had been tried before on the Western Front. Instead of the usual hours or even days of bombardment before an attack, which told the enemy exactly when and where the assault was coming, this time the artillery pounded the targeted sector for just a few minutes before lifting. Those few minutes were enough to force the defenders into their dugouts, but not enough for reserves to be called forward. As the last shells exploded, Raw's men surged forward in small, scattered groups, using shell holes and folds in the ground for cover, rather than advancing in the shoulder-to-shoulder ranks that conventional doctrine demanded. They hurled grenades into trench bays before the defenders could regroup from the bombardment, then swarmed into the trenches, causing complete panic and confusion. The attackers didn't try to overwhelm every position in their path. If a bunker or fortified strongpoint proved too tough to take quickly, they bypassed it entirely, pushing deeper into the enemy position to cut communications and supply lines. Then, once isolated and cut off from reinforcement, these strongpoints could be dealt with later by the regular infantry coming up behind to secure what the stormtroopers had taken and mop up what was left. That day, the French position was taken quickly with far fewer losses than a conventional assault would have cost. It was a glimpse of a new kind of warfare that promised, at least for a time, to break the deadlock of the trenches. But it was also extremely violent, dangerous and costly for the stormtroopers themselves, because they were always at the very tip of the spear, always the first ones into the enemy's trenches, always the ones absorbing the initial burst of defensive fire. This was the fundamental paradox of the stormtrooper concept. The tactics worked, but they consumed the best soldiers at an unsustainable rate. The stormtroopers' best allies were speed and shock. Their equipment reflected that philosophy down to the smallest detail. They carried shorter carbines instead of the full-length Gewehr 98 rifle because the shorter weapon was easier to handle in trenches. The whole squad was organised with different roles and different weapons, creating a combined arms team in miniature that could deal with any situation it encountered. Grenadiers moved with sacks packed with stick grenades, carrying as many as a dozen of the distinctive potato masher grenades in canvas bags slung over their shoulders. Grenades were ideal for clearing trenches because they could be thrown around corners and into dugout entrances without exposing the thrower. The long-barreled Luger pistol fitted with a shoulder stock and a 32-round drum magazine was used before the arrival of the Bergmann MP-18, giving individual stormtroopers a level of firepower that was unmatched by any other infantry weapon of the period. The long barrel improved accuracy, the shoulder stock allowed aimed fire at longer ranges, and the drum magazine meant the shooter didn't have to reload after every 8 rounds. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating weapon in the stormtrooper arsenal was the flamethrower. The Wechselapparat and the lighter Clive models could project a stream of burning fuel up to 20 yards, and the sight of liquid fire pouring into a trench bay was so terrifying that defenders often abandoned their positions just upon seeing a flamethrower being brought forward without waiting for it to be fired. The psychological impact of the flamethrower far exceeded its practical military value, which was limited by the weapon's short range, heavy weight, and the vulnerability of the operator, who carried a tank of highly flammable fuel on his back and was the #1 target for every enemy soldier who could see him. Flamethrower operators had among the shortest life expectancies of any soldiers in the war, and they knew it, Captured flamethrower operators were rarely taken prisoner. Stormtroopers trained extensively in mock trench systems built behind the lines, practicing and preparing for real combat until every man could perform his role in his sleep. However, nothing could prepare them for the actual missions they were about to be thrown into, because training could simulate the physical demands, but it could never simulate the terror of doing it for real, with real bullets and real grenades and real men trying to kill you. A conventional assault was usually preceded by a prolonged artillery barrage that would soften up defensive positions and clear the barbed wire, but it would also make the other side expect and prepare for the attack. Stormtrooper assaults were completely different. They would either go under the cover of fog or a moonless night, or even more terrifying, use the tactic called creeping artillery, what was officially known as the Feuerwalzer, the fire waltz. This was basically a moving curtain of artillery fire that inched forward ahead of them according to a pre-arranged timetable. The stormtroopers would advance as close as possible to the last line of bursting shells, sometimes just 50 or 60 yards behind the explosions, so that when the barrage moved forward, they were already on top of the enemy positions before the defenders could emerge from their dugouts. This was an incredibly dangerous tactic that required flawless coordination with not-so-accurate artillery, where one short shot, one shell that fell 50 yards behind where it was supposed to land, could kill you before the mission even began. Stormtroopers were killed by their own artillery with sickening regularity, and the survivors learned to accept this as a normal operational hazard. But this was a very effective tactic, at least when it worked, because it caught defenders completely off guard and gave stormtroopers an opportunity to exploit the confusion. Even poison gas was occasionally included in the opening bombardment, mixed with high explosive shells, so stormtroopers sometimes advanced and fought with gas masks on, which reduced their visibility, made communication almost impossible, and added another layer of nightmare to an already horrific experience. If that doesn't show how dangerous their job was, I don't know how else to put it. After arriving at the front, stormtroopers would first study the terrain and the enemy positions, learning the locations of wire obstacles, strong points, machine gun nests, and communication trenches. Scout patrols went out nightly to map the ground and identify the best approach routes. Then, once they had their plan worked out, they would prepare and set for action. Under cover of darkness, they crossed no man's land in loose order, camouflaged and moving quietly. Wire was cut silently with special tools, and gaps were made without alerting sentries. At least they tried to do it silently, because one wrong step, one metallic clink of wire cutters, one sneeze, could bring down artillery flares that would illuminate no man's land. And well, then your mission was probably over, because you'd be lying in the open, caught between the enemy's trench and your own, with machine guns opening up from both directions. And many missions ended exactly like this, never to be mentioned in official accounts so as not to damage morale. Once through the wire, any sentries had to be eliminated quickly and quietly before the main attack moved in. Then they would jump into the enemy trenches, and the chaos began. Grenades, gunfire, screams in the middle of the night, all of a sudden, and they pressed forward to secure key positions. Each small group acted independently according to the overall plan, and this decentralization of command, what the Germans called Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics, allowed them to exploit opportunities in the chaos of battle in real time. Instead of waiting for orders from a distant headquarters, junior officers and NCOs were empowered to make their own decisions based on what they saw in front of them. This was revolutionary for the time and represented a fundamental break from the rigid, top-down command structure that characterized most armies of the period. Now, if there was ever a moment when the stormtroopers announced themselves to the world, it was February 1916 at Verdun. This time, it wasn't just another small raid in the night. This was a full-scale offensive, and Willy Rohr's shock troops were in the very first wave. The Battle of Verdun was conceived by German Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn as an operation designed not to break through the French lines, but to bleed the French army to death by attacking a position that France could not afford to lose. Verdun was one of the most heavily fortified cities in France, protected by a ring of massive concrete forts, and it held enormous symbolic significance for the French nation. Falkenhayn believed that the French would throw everything they had into defending Verdun, and that the resulting battle of attrition would destroy the French army as an effective fighting force. After a brief but violent bombardment, as the last shells landed, the stormtroopers were already emerging from the smoke over no man's land. The French barely had time to exit their dugouts before the forward trenches were overrun. Germans slipped past the strongest points, not even trying to capture them, and infiltrated deeper into the French positions, cutting communications and sowing confusion behind the lines. Within the first days of the operation, a small raiding party of just 19 officers and 79 men from the 24th Brandenburg Regiment set their sights on Fort Douaumont, the largest fortress in Verdun's defensive ring. It was a massive concrete structure with walls 12 feet thick, surrounded by a dry moat, and mounting a 155mm gun turret and several 75mm guns. It should have been impregnable. But the French, in one of the most remarkable blunders of the war, had stripped its garrison down to a skeleton crew, believing that the heavy guns had been removed and that the fort was no longer militarily significant. Creeping up under cover of the bombardment's dust and smoke, the German party discovered an undefended way in through an open gun turret on the northeast face. Slipping inside, they found a tiny garrison caught completely by surprise. The few French artillerymen in the fort had no idea that German troops were even in the area, and they surrendered without a shot being fired. The fall of Douaumont shocked the French army and the French nation. It was a psychological blow as much as a strategic one. The strongest fort in the Verdun defensive system, a symbol of French military engineering and national resistance, had been captured by fewer than 100 men who simply walked in through an open door. Verdun would, of course, grind on for months in horrific slaughter, and the French would eventually retake the fort. But the stormtroopers had proven beyond doubt that their methods could achieve results once thought impossible. From then on, Allied soldiers never knew when or where these assault troops might suddenly appear, and it had a profound impact on soldiers' minds. The psychological effect of stormtrooper tactics extended far beyond the actual damage they inflicted. The knowledge that at any moment, without warning, a group of heavily armed, highly trained killers might appear in your trench created a constant state of anxiety that wore down defenders' morale and combat effectiveness. Soldiers who had to spend every night wondering whether this would be the night the stormtroopers came couldn't sleep properly, couldn't rest, and gradually deteriorated physically and mentally. By 1917, the stormtrooper approach had been adopted across the entire German army. Commanders selected the best fighters in each division to form storm sections for special assaults, while veterans of Raw's original unit trained regular infantry in the new tactics. The concept spread from a single experimental battalion to a doctrine that permeated the entire force. The British, having seen the effectiveness of these methods from the receiving end, reorganized their platoon structure to mirror the German model, breaking each platoon into specialized sections with different weapons and roles. The French were more cautious and never committed to large-scale storm units in the way the Germans did, though they developed their own assault techniques that incorporated elements of the German approach, while the Italians had their own infamous equivalent, the arditi, which translates roughly as the daring ones or the bold ones. These were borderline crazy volunteers, often choosing to fight with nothing but grenades and their signature daggers in hand-to-hand charges that terrified even hardened veterans. The arditi recruited from the most aggressive and fearless soldiers in the Italian army, men who had proven themselves in combat and who were willing to accept the near certainty of being killed or wounded in exchange for the prestige and privileges that came with serving in an elite unit. They were given better food, better pay, better quarters, and the freedom to behave in ways that would have gotten regular soldiers court-martialed. They scared the life out of the Austro-Hungarian troops they fought, but they suffered catastrophic losses in their operations. It wasn't rare for entire arditi units to go on a mission and for simply no one to return. Their casualty rates were staggering even by the standards of a war that had produced unprecedented levels of slaughter. And then came one of the stormtroopers' most devastating performances, the Battle of Caporetto in October 1917. This battle demonstrated what the new tactics could achieve when applied on a grand scale with proper preparation and coordination. German and Austro-Hungarian forces launched a surprise attack against the Italian front in the Julian Alps. The plan began with a short but intense artillery strike, including gas shells and smoke to blind and disorient the surviving defenders. Then, as the last shells fell, the stormtroopers did what they did best. They infiltrated at the weak points, slipping past strong positions and pushing deep into the rear. In hours, the whole front was torn open, and stormtroopers pushed an astonishing 15 miles deep into Italian territory on the first day alone. The Italian defence collapsed as panic turned into surrender on a massive scale. In total, 265,000 Italian soldiers were taken prisoner. Another 10,000 were killed and 30,000 wounded in the action. The Italian army was driven back nearly 70 miles to the Piave River before the line could be stabilised with British and French reinforcements. Among the stormtroopers at Caporetto was a young German lieutenant who would become famous decades later in the Second World War, Erwin Rommel. With just a handful of men, young Rommel encountered a much larger Italian force in the mountains. Using bluff and rapid movement to create the impression of a far bigger unit, Rommel convinced roughly 1,500 Italian soldiers to lay down their arms and surrender to him. And surprisingly, it worked. Rommel's performance at Caporetto earned him the Pour le Mérite, Imperial Germany's highest military decoration, and the tactical lessons he learned there would inform his command style throughout the Second World War. Caporetto was such a complete disaster for the Italians that the word itself entered the Italian language as a synonym for total debacle, and it is still used that way today. The Allies, disturbed by what they had witnessed at Caporetto, began working urgently on ways to defend against such infiltration attacks. But the stormtroopers' most ambitious operation was still to come. You might wonder how they managed to stay wide-eyed and combat-ready for days straight, pushing forward continuously without sleep, without proper food, and under constant fire. The answer is Pervitin, a fancy German name slapped over what was actually methamphetamine pills. While Pervitin became more widely associated with the Wehrmacht of the Second World War, the use of stimulants to maintain combat effectiveness over extended operations had its roots in the First World War, where stormtroopers were given various stimulants, including cocaine and caffeine preparations, to keep them fighting beyond normal human endurance. The ethics of drugging soldiers to keep them in combat is a subject for another day, but the practice tells you something about just how demanding these operations were, that commanders considered chemical stimulation necessary to keep their best soldiers functioning. Now, let's talk about what it was actually like inside a trench raid from the perspective of the men doing it, because the tactical descriptions and historical accounts can make these operations sound almost clinical, almost like a well-rehearsed military exercise. The reality was anything but. Imagine yourself crouching in a fire trench just before midnight. You've blackened your face. You've checked your weapons for the 10th time. Your stomach is churning and your mouth is completely dry. You're wearing a wool uniform that's already damp from the perpetual moisture in the trench, and you can feel the cold seeping into your bones. The man next to you, your friend, the one you've been sharing a dugout with for weeks, is so scared that his hands are visibly shaking, and he's trying to hide it by gripping his trench club so tightly that his knuckles are white even under the cork blacking. Nobody says a word. The only sounds are the distant rumble of artillery somewhere down the line, the occasional crack of a rifle shot, and the relentless dripping of water. The officer checks his watch, nods, and the first man goes over the top. You follow him into the darkness. No man's land at night is a sensory assault unlike anything you've experienced before. The smell hits you first. That indescribable mixture of decomposing flesh, chemical residue from gas attacks, cordite, wet earth and latrine waste that seem to permeate everything within a mile of the front line. Then, the sounds. Or rather, the absence of sounds you expect, and the presence of sounds you don't. No birds, no insects in winter, just the distant popping of flares, the occasional stutter of a machine gun, and, underneath it all, a low, constant, indefinable murmuring that might be the wind through the wire, or might be the sounds of thousands of men trying to stay alive on the other side of no man's land. You're on your belly now, crawling forward through mud that tries to suck you down with every movement. Your elbows and knees are sinking into what feels like wet clay, and every time you pull them free, there's a small squelching sound that to your terrified ears sounds as loud as a gunshot. You can feel objects under your body as you crawl over them. Pieces of equipment, fragments of shell casing, and sometimes something that gives under your weight in a way that metal and wood don't, something soft and yielding. And you know what it is, but you don't let yourself think about it. You just keep crawling. Ahead of you, barely visible in the darkness, the man in front has stopped. Everyone stops. A flare goes up from the German line, a bright white light that turns the whole landscape into a bleached, shadowless photograph. You press your face into the mud and close your eyes. The light is so bright you can see it through your eyelids, a red glow that makes the darkness behind your eyes look like firelight. You can hear your heartbeat in your ears, faster than you've ever heard it. You don't breathe. Nobody breathes. The flare hisses and swings on its parachute, and the shadows wheel crazily around you. After what feels like an hour but is probably 45 seconds, the light dies and the darkness comes rushing back, and for a moment you can't see anything at all because your eyes have to readjust. Then you start crawling again. The wire. You reach the German wire and it's like crawling into a forest of razor blades. Even with the rubber gloves, the barbs catch on your uniform, your equipment, your skin. Every strand you push aside springs back and catches on something else. The man with the wire cutters is working as fast as he dares, but every cut produces a metallic snap that he tries to muffle with his hands, and each snap makes everyone freeze for a second, waiting to see if it was heard. You're lying in the wire for what feels like forever, completely exposed, unable to move forward or backward, tangled in a web of steel that would take you minutes to free yourself from if you had to move suddenly. If a flare goes up now, if a machine gun opens up now, you're dead. There's nothing you can do about it. You just lie there and wait for the wireman to finish. Then you're through the wire and you can see the edge of the German trench. A dark line in the slightly less dark ground, maybe 15 feet ahead of you. You can hear German soldiers talking in low voices. Someone coughs. Someone is moving equipment. A metallic clanking sound. You reach for your club. The assault leader raises his hand. And then everything happens at once. You're on your feet, 3 steps, and you're at the edge of the trench. You jump. The drop is farther than you expected, maybe 8 feet, and you land hard on the duck boards at the bottom. A German soldier is right in front of you, turned away, and before he can react, before he can even turn around, you swing the club. The impact travels up your arm. The man drops. There's shouting now, explosions, grenades going off around the traverse, screams that could be German or could be your own men. You can't tell. Someone fires a pistol and the muzzle flash blinds you for a second. You stumble forward, trip over a body, catch yourself on the trench wall. Around the next corner there's a German soldier with a rifle trying to work the bolt with hands that are shaking as badly as yours were 5 minutes ago. He never gets it loaded. This is what trench raiding was. Not strategy, not tactics, not the elegant diagrams and tidy arrows on the officers' maps. It was men killing men at arm's length in the dark, in the mud, in a space so narrow that you could reach out and touch both walls, fighting with weapons that would have been familiar to a Viking or a Roman legionary. And it happened night after night after night for 4 years along 440 miles of front. The psychological toll on the raiders was immense and cumulative. Many men who survived multiple raids described a progressive deadening of emotion, a numbness that settled over them like a protective shell. They stopped fearing death because they had seen so much of it that it had become normalized. They stopped fearing killing because they had done so much of it that the horror had faded into routine. Some veterans described the raids with a detached, almost clinical precision that unnerved the people they told. Others couldn't talk about them at all, not because they had forgotten, but because the memories were so vivid and so terrible that speaking them aloud seemed to give them a power they preferred to keep locked away. What we would now diagnose as post-traumatic stress disorder was endemic among trench raiders, though in 1914 to 1918 it was called shell shock, and soldiers who showed its symptoms were often treated as cowards or malingerers rather than as casualties. There were also the raids that went catastrophically wrong, and these were far more common than the successful operations that make it into the history books. Raids where the artillery support fired short and killed the raiders before they reached the wire. Raids where the enemy was waiting, having detected the preparations through intelligence or observation, and opened up with everything they had the moment the raiders showed themselves. Raids where the raiders reached the enemy trench only to find it heavily defended by alert troops who had been warned by the sound of wire being cut. Raids where the withdrawal was cut off by enemy fire and the entire party was killed or captured. Raids where the raiders got lost in no man's land and wandered in circles until dawn exposed them to enemy fire. Each of these failures produced casualties, and each set of casualties meant that the next raid would be conducted by less experienced men, which meant it was more likely to fail, which meant more casualties, in a cycle that ground through the army's best soldiers at an appalling rate. The larger raids, involving hundreds of men rather than dozens, were particularly costly. As the war progressed, commanders became increasingly ambitious with their raiding operations, sending larger forces against bigger objectives with more complex plans. These large-scale raids often had all the disadvantages of a conventional assault, since the large number of men made it impossible to maintain the stealth that small raids depended on, combined with none of the advantages since they lacked the artillery support and reserve strength of a proper attack. Some of the worst casualties of the war were suffered in raids that had grown so large and so complex that they had effectively become miniature battles with all the confusion, chaos, and slaughter that implied. The Canadian Corps, for all its expertise in raiding, suffered heavily in these large operations, and some of its most experienced raiders were lost in raids that, in retrospect, should never have been ordered. However, even Caporetto and the victories of 1917 were not the stormtroopers' grandest moment. That, believe it or not, was still to come. It was March 1918, and with Russia out of the war following the Bolshevik Revolution and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Germany could finally turn its full attention to the Western Front. This was to be their last all-or-nothing gamble for victory before the weight of American manpower and industrial production tipped the balance irretrievably against them. Nearly 50 divisions were transferred from the Eastern Front to the West, and for the first time since the opening months of 1914, Germany actually outnumbered the Allies on the Western Front. This was their chance to win the war before the American Expeditionary Force arrived in overwhelming numbers. General Erich Ludendorff, who had effectively taken control of Germany's military strategy, staked everything on one massive spring offensive that would break the Allied line and end the war. The plan was codenamed Operation Michael, and it would be the largest military operation on the Western Front since the initial campaigns of 1914. The spring offensive began with one of the most concentrated bombardments of the entire war, a masterpiece of artillery planning devised by Colonel Georg Bruchmüller, who had perfected his techniques on the Eastern Front and was now applying them to the Western Front for the first time. Over 6,500 German guns and 3,500 trench mortars opened fire along a front of about 40 miles. In just 5 hours, they fired approximately 3.5 million shells, including high explosive, shrapnel, smoke, and poison gas. The barrage was carefully choreographed, with different types of ammunition being fired at specific targets according to a precise timetable. Counter-battery fire targeted Allied artillery positions first, using gas shells to force the crews to put on masks that reduced their effectiveness. Then the barrage shifted to the front-line trenches, followed by the support and reserve lines, then back to the front line again, in a rolling pattern designed to keep the defenders off balance and unable to predict when the infantry assault would begin. Fog on the morning of March 21, 1918, allowed stormtroopers to slip deep into British positions without being seen. The fog was not planned, but it was providential for the attackers. Visibility was reduced to less than 20 yards in places, which meant that the machine guns and rifles that had made frontal assaults suicidal for 4 years were rendered almost useless. The defenders couldn't see the attackers until they were on top of them, and by then it was too late. Under cover of fog, smoke, and gas, and shielded by a carefully timed creeping barrage, stormtrooper units moved forward in small, scattered groups. British sentries who survived the opening barrage never even saw them coming. They slipped through the British forward outpost zones, bypassing or quickly overwhelming the thinly manned positions, then pressed deep into the rear before defenders could regroup. Large stretches of the British line began to crumble as stormtroopers appeared behind positions that the defenders thought were still holding. Panic spread in outflanked or surrounded units, with Germans appearing from unexpected directions. Thousands of British soldiers were cut off from their headquarters, their supply lines, and their neighbours, and had no choice but to surrender. By nightfall on the first day, the British had been driven back several miles along a wide front. For the first time in more than 3 years, the deadlock of trench warfare had been broken, and German troops now stood in positions that had been considered all but impregnable just hours before. They achieved the deepest advances on the Western Front since 1914. Pushing forward 40 miles in just 2 weeks. For the first time in years, warfare became mobile again. Roads that had been behind the British lines for 3 years were suddenly contested battlefields. Towns that had served as British headquarters, supply depots, and rest areas were overrun. Thousands of prisoners, hundreds of guns, and vast quantities of supplies were captured. For a few giddy days in late March and early April 1918, it genuinely looked like Germany might actually have a chance to win the war. But the problem was that the Germans had not expected such success, and they weren't adequately prepared to take advantage of it. Stormtroopers quickly moved faster than their own artillery could follow, and supply lines collapsed over the cratered wasteland that the initial bombardment had created. The same shell-torn, wire-tangled, trench-scarred landscape that had stopped Allied advances for 4 years now prevented the Germans from moving ammunition, food, water and reinforcements forward fast enough to sustain the momentum of the attack. Horse-drawn supply wagons bogged down in the mud. Motor vehicles couldn't navigate the shattered roads. Even the stormtroopers themselves, exhausted after days of continuous fighting without proper rest or resupply, began to lose their edge. And here is where the fatal flaw of the stormtrooper concept became devastatingly apparent. The best men had been pulled out of regular units and concentrated into storm units. These were the bravest, the fittest, the most aggressive, the most experienced soldiers in the entire German army. And these elite soldiers suffered disproportionately heavy casualties that simply couldn't be replaced. They were always at the very front, in continuous action for days on end, always leading the advance, always the first to encounter resistance, always the ones who had to clear the most dangerous positions. Those who weren't killed or wounded were pushed beyond the limits of human exhaustion, fighting without food and ammunition for days at a time. Unlike earlier operations where stormtroopers would break a line and then be replaced by regular infantry while they rested and refitted, here they were kept advancing without relief until they were simply worn out, broken down by fatigue, hunger, and the cumulative stress of constant combat. In Operation Michael alone, the German army suffered around 240,000 casualties, and the stormtrooper units bore the highest losses of all. Some storm battalions were completely wiped out, with all their experienced fighters gone and no equivalent replacements left to fill the gaps. You can't replace a veteran stormtrooper with a raw recruit. The skills, the instincts, the combat experience that made stormtroopers effective couldn't be taught in a few weeks of training. They were the product of months and years of combat, of surviving dozens of raids and assaults, of learning by doing in the most unforgiving classroom on Earth. When those men were killed, their knowledge and expertise died with them. This meant that the follow-up attacks lacked the same impact because the cutting edge of the German assault had been dulled beyond repair. There was also a psychological phenomenon that contributed to the stalling of the advance. When stormtroopers overran British positions, they found something they hadn't seen in years: food. Real food. Bread, meat, jam, chocolate, tea, coffee, wine, spirits. The British supply dumps were stocked with provisions that German soldiers, subjected to the Allied naval blockade that had reduced the German civilian and military diet to near starvation levels, hadn't tasted in months or years. Entire units stopped attacking to feast on captured supplies. Officers reported finding their men drunk on captured whiskey and wine, or sitting in captured dugouts eating captured rations while the advance stalled around them. This wasn't cowardice or indiscipline. It was the inevitable result of asking starving men to advance through a landscape filled with food. The contrast between what the British soldiers ate and what the German soldiers ate told the attacking troops everything they needed to know about who was winning the war of attrition, regardless of what the day's tactical success might suggest. The offensive eventually stalled. Germany launched 4 more major offensives between April and July 1918, each one weaker than the last as the stormtrooper units were ground down and replacements couldn't match the quality of the men they were replacing. The Aisne offensive in May achieved spectacular initial gains but ran out of steam within days. The Metz offensive in June was contained almost immediately. The final German offensive, the Second Battle of the Marne in July, was a disaster that was stopped within hours and immediately followed by a devastating French counterattack. By July 1918, the spring offensive had ground to a halt and the initiative passed to the Allies, now reinforced by fresh American troops. Arriving at a rate of 250,000 per month, they hit back in what became known as the 100 Days Offensive, beginning with the Battle of Amiens on August 8, 1918, which Ludendorff called the Black Day of the German Army. Over 400 tanks, supported by aircraft, artillery and massed infantry, smashed into the German lines and advanced 8 miles in a single day, shattering several German divisions completely. The exhausted German forces were driven into a never-ending retreat that would continue until the armistice. The stormtroopers had proved just how devastatingly effective they could be, but at a cost so great that they became quite literally the victims of their own success. By concentrating the best soldiers into elite units and using them as the spearhead of every major operation, the German army had created a military instrument of extraordinary power, and then consumed it in the fires of its own ambition. The Storm battalions were burned up in the spring offensives, and with them went Germany's last realistic chance of winning the war. By autumn, over 100,000 German prisoners had been taken by the advancing Allies, and the German army was disintegrating from within. Morale had collapsed. Desertions were increasing daily. Soldiers who had fought with extraordinary courage for 4 years simply stopped fighting, surrendering in large numbers or melting away from their units. The home front was starving and exhausted. Revolution was brewing. The Kaiser's government was crumbling. And on November 11th, 1918, the armistice was signed, and the guns fell silent along the entire Western Front for the first time in more than 4 years. The war ended, and the few stormtroopers who had survived were disbanded in the mass demobilization that followed. They returned to civilian life carrying the memories of the horrors they had experienced for the rest of their lives. Some adapted. Some didn't. Some spent decades trying to forget what they had seen and done, and some spent decades trying to explain it to people who could never understand because they hadn't been there. The physical wounds healed, more or less. But the psychological wounds, what we now call PTSD, never fully went away for most of them. The legacy of the trench raiders and stormtroopers extended far beyond the First World War itself. The tactical innovations they developed, the principles of infiltration, fire and movement, decentralized command, combined arms at the squad level, bypassing strong points and exploiting gaps, became the foundation of modern infantry tactics. The German army of the Second World War built its entire operational doctrine on the stormtrooper tactics of 1918, refined and expanded to incorporate tanks, aircraft, and motorized infantry into what the world would come to know as blitzkrieg. The concept of the stormtrooper, the highly trained, heavily armed, tactically independent small unit that could operate deep behind enemy lines, influenced the development of special forces in every major military in the world. The weapons evolved as well. The MP-18 submachine gun begat the Thompson, which begat the Sten, which begat the MP-40, which begat the AK-47 and the M16 and every assault rifle and personal defense weapon that equips modern soldiers today. The trench club and the sharpened shovel evolved into the modern combat knife and the entrenching tool that every infantry soldier still carries. The Mills bomb and the stick grenade evolved into the modern fragmentation grenade. The steel helmet evolved from the Stahlhelm through dozens of iterations into the Kevlar helmets worn by soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq. Every piece of equipment that a modern infantryman carries has its origin, in one form or another, in the trenches of the Western Front. The trench raid itself evolved into the commando raid of the Second World War, the special operations mission of the Cold War era, and the surgical strike of the modern war on terror. The same basic principle, a small group of highly trained men inserted covertly to accomplish a specific objective and then extracted before the enemy can respond effectively, has remained remarkably consistent from 1915 to the present day. When British commandos raided the dry dock at Saint-Nazaire in 1942, they were applying the same principles that the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry had used at St. Eloi in 1915. When American Rangers scaled the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc on D-Day, they were conducting a trench raid on a massive scale. When Navy SEALs descended on Abbottabad in 2011, the tactical DNA of the operation could be traced directly back to those blackened-faced Canadians crawling through no man's land a century earlier. The concept of small, highly aggressive, autonomous assault teams infiltrating enemy defences kept evolving through the decades. We know them today by names like Navy SEAL teams, the SAS, Delta Force, the GSG-9, Sayeret Matkal, Spetsnaz, and dozens of other elite units around the world. These are the modern-day high-tech trench raiders. They use night vision instead of burnt cork. They communicate by encrypted radio instead of hand signals. They carry suppressed weapons instead of clubs and shovels. They insert by helicopter or submarine instead of crawling on their bellies. But the fundamental concept is the same. a small number of exceptionally trained individuals operating under conditions of extreme danger, using speed, surprise, and violence of action to accomplish objectives that larger conventional forces cannot. The physical trenches of the Western Front have largely disappeared, ploughed under by farmers, grown over by forests, or preserved as memorial sites that receive visitors who try and inevitably fail to imagine what it was like. The shell-cratered moonscape of the Somme is now peaceful farmland where wheat and sugar beets grow in soil that still yields bones, bullets, and unexploded ordnance every spring when the ploughs go through. The ridge at Vimy, taken by Canadian stormtroopers in April 1917, is a Canadian national memorial and park where the preserved trenches are clean and dry, and nothing at all like what they were in 1917. Verdun's forts have been restored and open to tourists who walk through concrete corridors that still bear the scars of shell fire and the graffiti of soldiers who sheltered there a century ago. The Menin Gate at Ypres bears the names of nearly 55,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers whose bodies were never recovered from the mud of Flanders, and every evening at 8 o'clock the last post is sounded there, a tradition that has been maintained without interruption, except during the German occupation in the Second World War, since 1928. But the men who fought there, the raiders and the stormtroopers, the men who crawled through the mud and the wire and killed other men with clubs and sharpened shovels in the dark, they are all gone now. The last verified combat veteran of the First World War, Claude Schouel, died in 2011 at the age of 110. The last French veteran, Lazare Ponticelli, died in 2008 at 110. The last known trench raider is lost to history, his name unrecorded, his stories untold, his memories buried with him in whatever churchyard or military cemetery holds his remains. What remains is the record of what they did, and the echo of their experience in the military organizations and doctrines that evolved from their sacrifice. The modern soldier, with his body armor and night vision goggles and suppressed weapon and encrypted communications, owes a debt he doesn't always know about to those men who crawled through the mud of Flanders and Picardy with cork-blackened faces and sharpened shovels, who fought and killed and died in the dark so that someone else might learn, someday, a better way to fight. And if you think about it, the trenches themselves were a kind of monument to human stubbornness. For 4 years, the greatest minds of the most advanced civilization in history threw everything they had at those lines, and the lines barely moved. Generals who had studied Napoleon and Frederick the Great and Clausewitz found themselves presiding over a war that none of their education had prepared them for. They tried everything. They tried massed artillery, they tried massed infantry, they tried cavalry, they tried gas, they tried tanks, they tried tunneling underneath the enemy positions and detonating massive mines, like at Messines in June 1917, where 19 mines containing nearly 1 million pounds of explosives were detonated simultaneously beneath the German positions on the ridge, creating explosions so large that they were felt in London and killed an estimated 10,000 German soldiers in a single instant. The crater from the largest mine, the Lochnagar crater at La Boisselle, is still there today, 90 feet deep and 300 feet across, a permanent scar on the landscape that will outlast every human being alive today. They tried flamethrowers. They tried aircraft. They tried elaborate deception operations. They tried attacking at dawn, at dusk, at midnight, in fog, in rain, in snow. They tried coordinating attacks along the entire front simultaneously, hoping to prevent the enemy from shifting reserves. They tried concentrating all their strength on a single narrow sector, hoping to punch through by sheer weight of numbers. And none of it worked. Or rather, all of it worked for a few hours or a few days, and then the defenders would bring up reserves, seal the breach, and the front line would solidify again, a few hundred yards forward or backward from where it had been before, at a cost of tens or hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides. The trench raid was, in a sense, the honest answer to this stalemate. It acknowledged what the grand offensives refused to admit, that the Western Front couldn't be broken by brute force alone, that the defenders' advantage was too great, and that the only way to accomplish anything meaningful was to do it quietly, in small groups, at night, with weapons that didn't announce your presence to every machine gun crew within a mile. The trench raiders didn't pretend that they were going to win the war. They just tried to survive the night and accomplish whatever small objective they had been given. And in doing so, they stumbled onto tactical principles that would prove far more important and far more enduring than any of the grand strategies that consumed millions of lives for negligible gains. The training of trench raiders became increasingly sophisticated as the war progressed. By 1917, specialized raiding schools had been established behind the lines on all sides, where soldiers were taught the skills of night movement, silent killing, demolition, prisoner handling, and the psychology of close-quarters combat. The British established training facilities at Étaples and other rear area camps where mock trench systems were built to exact specifications, and raiding parties rehearsed their operations repeatedly before executing them. These rehearsals included live fire exercises where soldiers practiced advancing behind real artillery barrages and throwing live grenades into mock dugouts. The realism of the training was considered essential because the disorientation and confusion of an actual raid could only be partially simulated, and the more realistic the training, the better prepared the soldiers would be when the real thing happened. The Canadians, who had established themselves as the premier raiding force on the Western Front, developed their training to the highest level of any army. Canadian raiding schools taught not just the physical skills of raiding, but also the planning and intelligence gathering aspects. Officers learned how to study aerial photographs to identify targets, how to interrogate captured prisoners for information about enemy dispositions, and how to coordinate with artillery, engineers, and signals units to create a comprehensive raid plan. NCOs learned how to lead small groups in the dark, how to maintain control of their men when everything was going wrong, and how to make instant decisions under conditions of extreme stress and confusion. The emphasis on junior leadership was particularly important because in the chaos of a trench raid, the plan rarely survived first contact with the enemy, and the ability of corporals and sergeants to adapt and improvise was often the difference between success and disaster. Physical fitness was also emphasized in a way that was unusual for the period. Raiders were expected to be able to crawl for hundreds of yards, sprint short distances while carrying heavy equipment, climb over obstacles, fight hand-to-hand, and then repeat the whole process in reverse while possibly carrying a wounded comrade or a struggling prisoner. The physical demands were more akin to what we would now associate with Special Forces selection than with conventional infantry training. Men who couldn't meet the physical standards were weeded out, and there was no shortage of volunteers to replace them, because raiding carried a certain prestige that attracted the kind of men who were drawn to danger and excitement, even in a war that had more than enough of both for everyone. The selection of personnel for raiding parties was a delicate business that required balancing multiple competing concerns. You wanted aggressive, fit, experienced men who wouldn't panic in close combat. But you also needed to balance the demands of raiding against the need to maintain the overall combat effectiveness of the battalion. Because if you sent your best soldiers on raids every week and kept losing them, eventually the whole unit would be degraded. Some battalion commanders rotated their raiding parties, giving every platoon a turn, while others maintained a dedicated raiding section made up of specialists. There was also the question of volunteers versus ordered men. Most armies preferred to use volunteers for raids because motivated men performed better and because ordering unwilling soldiers into the kind of desperate close-quarters fighting that raiding demanded was unlikely to produce good results. But as the war went on and casualties mounted, the pool of willing volunteers shrank, and more men had to be ordered into raiding parties, which inevitably reduced their effectiveness. The emotional bonds between raiders were intense, forged in the most extreme conditions that human beings can experience together. Men who crawled through no man's land together, who killed together, who nearly died together, developed a bond that was different from ordinary military camaraderie. It was closer to the kind of relationship that exists between members of modern special forces units, a brotherhood born of shared danger and mutual dependence that transcended rank, class, and nationality. Some of the deepest friendships and the most heartbreaking losses of the war occurred within raiding parties, where men who had entrusted their lives to each other watched their closest friends die in the mud of no man's land or in the dark corners of enemy trenches. The medical treatment available to wounded raiders was primitive by modern standards, and often inadequate for the kinds of injuries that trench fighting produced. Bayonet wounds, club injuries, grenade fragments, and burns from flamethrowers all required different treatment, and field hospitals near the front lines were often overwhelmed by the volume and variety of casualties. Many wounded raiders died of infection because antiseptics were scarce, and the mud of the trenches carried bacteria that caused gas gangrene, tetanus, and septicemia. Men with shattered bones often lost limbs because there was no way to save them in the conditions of a field hospital. Burns from flamethrowers were particularly horrific and often fatal, and even survivors faced months or years of painful treatment and permanent disfigurement. The medical services did their best, but their best was often not enough, and many men who survived the raid itself died in the hours and days that followed, from wounds that modern medicine could have treated routinely. The legacy of the trench raiders lives on in ways that most people never realize. Every time a special forces team conducts a night raid, every time a commando unit infiltrates behind enemy lines, every time a hostage rescue team breaches a door and clears a room, they are using techniques and principles that were first developed by men with blackened faces and sharpened shovels in the trenches of the Western Front. The direct lineage runs from those Canadian raiders at St. Eloi in 1915 through the German stormtroopers of 1917 to 1918, through the British Commandos and American Rangers of the Second World War, through the Special Operations Forces of the Cold War, and straight to the Tier 1 operators of today. The weapons have changed, the equipment has changed, the technology has changed, but the fundamental concept, a small group of exceptional men operating in the dark, moving fast, hitting hard and getting out before the enemy can respond, that concept has remained essentially unchanged for over a century. And it began in the mud and blood and darkness of the Western Front, with men who had nothing to rely on but their courage, their training, and each other. Europe in 1914 was considered the pinnacle of modern civilization, the most technologically advanced society the world had ever seen. It had electric lights, automobiles, telephones, moving pictures, ocean liners, and the telegraph. Its citizens believed with the serene confidence of the Edwardian age that progress was inevitable and that the future would be better than the past. And yet, this modern war, fought by the most educated, most industrialized, most technologically sophisticated nations on Earth, spiraled into the most primal and savage form of combat known to man. Despite artillery that could reach targets 20 miles behind the lines, despite machine guns that could fire 600 rounds per minute, despite airplanes that could observe the battlefield from above, despite submarines that could sink warships beneath the waves, despite tanks that could crawl over trenches and crush barbed wire, despite poison gas that could blind and choke and kill, it all eventually ended with clubs and sharpened shovels. With men killing men face to face in the dark with weapons that their ancestors 10,000 years ago would have recognized and understood. That is the true horror of the trench raiders. Not just what they did, but what their existence tells us about the nature of war itself. That no matter how far technology advances, no matter how sophisticated our weapons become, warfare always finds a way back to its most basic, most brutal, most human essence. Two men in the dark trying to kill each other before the other one kills them first.